So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Milina Macall is the food activist, and she really is a food activist. She is adjunct professor at Montclair State University. She is a founder of Boxed Organics, Guerrilla Gardening in Montclair, which is another organization. She is an advisor to Vegucation, which is a company who's also represented here today in this next room. And also Harvesting Hope, Madre, it's in parentheses after it. It's an organization that works to empower women in Nicaragua. Very fascinating. They have been disempowered by outside forces, and this project seeks to help them empower themselves again to take control of their food supply after many years of malnutrition and other issues. Please welcome Milina Macall.
Good afternoon, everybody. As you can hear, I come from far, far away, Montclair, New Jersey, and I'm a food activist. So usually when people say, so what do you do? And I say, I'm a food activist, I can see the veil closing and the confusion, and eventually they'll say, so what's that? And this is what I tell them, what I'm sharing with you. I'm committed to doing what I can towards ensuring everyone everywhere has access to affordable, fresh, nutritious and culturally appropriate food. And the two questions that I ask myself all the time, and I'd encourage you to ask yourselves, is how are we going to eat? And what are we going to eat? And that how is a very large word. We all eat, and we aren't machines. So let our food be more than fuel. Let us actively engage with our food and enjoy the production and consumption of our food. Food is the basic foundation for everything. It's a universal connector. We all eat, every one of us. When we break bread, strangers can become friends. Enemies, at least for that time, can be neutral when sharing food, and perhaps it will provide an opportunity to open dialogue. Food helps us concentrate and focus. So I think about school lunches, and I ask this question. None of us would accept a crappy math program at school. So why wouldn't we have the same standards of requirements for the lunch? How much fat, sugar and protein we consume all has a direct impact on our decision-making abilities and performances. Yes, all of us, adults, kids, it doesn't matter. And underneath all of that, we need to consider what goes into food production. It's the foundation for everything, food. Not just and it doesn't just have an impact on those who are eating it, but also those who are involved in its production. So consider, do the people who are behind the food that you're eating have fair working conditions? Is the food you're eating produced in a way which is environmentally responsible, both in its production and its distribution? And if the answer to any of those questions is no, or I don't know, what can you do in your life to make a change? However small, it's still an important change. We are so far off the mark, locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. So the question is, how do we change that? I'd like you all to imagine a fork, a four-pronged fork. Think of personal, local, national, and regional, and global. Every decision we make in our personal eating choices has an impact on our health, personally, and on the local, national, and global economy. Let me give you an example of a personal action. As you might hear, I'm not from America, so I grew up drinking tea. And I like to start my day with my morning cup of tea. And even that simple action can have far-reaching effects on the tea that I choose to drink. If I purchase my tea from a company that is fair trade certified, that is ensuring that the workers on the tea plantations have a living wage, that is ensuring that the conditions they are living in are sustainable, and empowering them to be independent, it's far different from a company where workers are paid below minimum wage, where their conditions leave them impoverished and therefore vulnerable to slave trafficking. I never thought that my cup of tea choice could be impacting whether a young woman is sold into slavery. And just this week there was an article about exactly this. And Tetley, one of the big companies in England, and in fact here, their parent company, one of their plantations is being investigated for this, and 21 young women were rescued in the course of a project that happened over the last few years from one plantation. So it might seem like a little thing, but it isn't. So you're going to say, well, what can I do to change that? consider what the highest point of entry for change would be for you. To start with, I can change the brand I buy to drink. I can purchase the tea from a local store, supporting my local economy, and supporting a store which stocks fair trade goods, thereby sending a message that I, as a consumer, am looking for fair trade goods. I can write to the importers of tea in the United States. Now I'm impacting on a national level, and I can explain my actions. And if lots of us do this, that large pile of letters and phone calls starts making people take notice. I can support organisations like the Ethical Tea Partnership, both financially and with signing petitions. And I can petition the company itself to address conditions on the plantations they buy from, pointing out that globally, us over here has an eye on those plantations, in this case in India. So how did I end up standing in front of you today? Just a regular person, travelled a bit, but otherwise not particularly interesting. And I came to the United States and I started my family, and like many people, having children was my entry point to really start to think a little bit more carefully about what I was doing for my health and for these new people that I had created. I felt a responsibility towards their health and towards their future, and therefore the planetary future. And I knew I wanted to avoid GMOs. GMOs are all over the news right now. It's very controversial. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they the providers of all evil? Are they the saviors of the starving? A million questions. And I don't know the answers to all of that, but I do know this. I know that I'm not convinced about their safety. Why? Because up until now, all the safety tests done on them are done by the very companies who are producing them. Conflict of interest for me. And I do know that if you have a plant which has been designed to be pesticide and herbicide resistant, like Roundup resistant crops, that there's going to be more spraying on them. There's more residual pesticides and herbicides, and I know I don't want to consume that. And I know I don't want more of that being sprayed. So I wanted to offer my family the safest food I could. And as there's no labelling here, my option was to go organic. And as all of you know, organic comes with a big price tag. And I don't want, personally, I don't want organic to be a privilege for the rich. So on my journey to this, I learned all kinds of things. I learned more ways how our food choices have a huge impact on the world. For example, for every pound of beef that is produced in an industrial production system in the United States, 12 pounds of grain is needed. So then you start asking yourself, well, maybe if we ate more of the plants and grew more crops that were edible crops for people and ate less meat, all the inputs that go into producing that pound of beef would be distributed better. My fundamental belief is that we as human beings have a duty of care to others, just by our existence. So I view all of us, the entire planet of human beings, as my larger extended family, and I want to try and extend the kind of responsibility that I extend to my direct family, my children, as much as I can on my larger family. So I figured out that with my area of speciality, which came just through this passion and quest for knowledge of food, that it would make sense that my contribution to sustainability and social justice should be food activism. That's a very long answer to the question, what am I when I'm a food activist? An example of some of the knowledge that I picked up going on right now, as I'm sure you're all aware, California is suffering from a serious drought. And what that means in terms of agriculture, and what that means for us, even our wallets, at the most selfish level. California produces nearly half of all the fruit and vegetables grown in the United States, and 80% of California's water is dedicated to agriculture. Some water-intensive crops include broccoli, 5.4 gallons for every head of broccoli grown, 3.3 gallons for a single tomato. Those numbers just sound insane to me. But then you start looking at how much water is required for livestock. 145,000 gallons per ton of beef versus 38,000 gallons per ton of fruit, of blue water. And blue water is water as defined, the water you would find in aquifers, lakes and rivers, the very water that is almost completely missing now in California. And the thirstiest plant grown is alfalfa. And alfalfa is grown extensively in California as a crop to feed cattle. And here's the biggest irony, it's being exported, not all of it, but a lot of it. We export 100 billion gallons worth of water in alfalfa crops to China at the moment to feed their enormously growing livestock population as China adopts more Western styles of eating. And even here, anywhere, it's 132 gallons of water per carcass in a slaughtering process. So this sounds just completely overwhelming. I can't go to California and change things. I can't go and change export policies or growth policies. But I can do the following. I can look at what I'm eating. If I reduce 50% of animal proteins in my diet to edible plant proteins, I'm going to have a 30% reduction in my food-related water footprint. And if I go vegetarian, and I'm not saying you should or shouldn't, I'm just letting you know the numbers, that would be a 60% reduction. And this week, another study, another way that is clearly the only way to eat, as all the studies are, tells us that a lower animal protein diet until we're in our 60s is the healthier way to go. So you can tell yourself that you're going to make yourself healthier while you're reducing your water footprint. So going back to how did I achieve being able to eat more organic food in my family, I looked around and set up Boxed Organics. And Boxed Organics was simply utilizing collective buying power. There were other people in the same situation as me. We formed a group. We used our money to be able to go directly to the farmers and distributors because we offered year-round. And we used our collective buying power to be able to buy it at a price that we could afford. Along the way, we had all kinds of learning experiences, and we still do. It's a great platform for education. Learned about all the different types of farming and what organic means, and biodynamic and IPM and conventional farming, and whether it's more important to buy from a certified organic farmer in California or a local farmer who has organic growing practices or other growing practices that you're comfortable with but hasn't got a certification. It's always a balance, as Jim mentioned, there's always this balance that you have to find between what you'd like to do in your utopian world and what you can do, and making that balance make sense. And be aware of the fact that we're all just human. We can do what we can do, okay? Don't beat yourself up that you're not perfect. The other big piece of Boxed Organics that I hadn't really thought about was that it really empowers people to cook for themselves. When they receive a box of food, mixed produce, and fruit and vegetables and salads, and we send out simple recipes, people become more adventurous in what they're going to eat because they've paid for it, it turns up, they stare at it, it stares back at them, then they pull out the recipe, and they start exploring more ways to cook. Kids, the famous kids who won't try anything, you've heard about them, are really excited. It's like a treasure box, and they unpack it and they find things like Romanesco. Do you all know what Romanesco is? Romanesco is, I think of it as a dinosaur food because it's so exotic and wild and crazy. Now, a child who still finds magic in the world, I mean, this is like the perfect magical plant. And you can talk about dinosaurs. Well, they'll tell you about them. You don't need to tell them. And they're much more interested because their senses are alive and they're empowered to get involved and get their hands dirty. The other piece of this was learning about our farmers. Because I was sitting there thinking, this is great, we're all doing well. I didn't really think about what it did for the farmers until I went to meet them and talk with them. And I learned we were really supporting them. Our little teeny tiny drop of water in this vast ocean was enabling farmers to do two things. To keep their farms and go back to them full time. Some of them had to have other jobs. And for others, they were inspired by seeing their fellow farmers being able to actually make a better living growing specialist organic crops than they had in growing vast conventional crops where the pricing was bad. So they were getting more money in the same piece of land, and their own personal health was improving. And I have to tell you, I was really humbled by seeing this impact of something that I really hadn't thought about at all. So every time you make a purchasing decision like that, there are all these great unknown consequences, many of which are immensely powerful. I volunteered at a food pantry. How many of you have volunteered at a local food pantry to help pack? And how many of you were delighted by what you found there? How many of you were appalled by what you found there? Anyone? Okay, so when you go there, it just basically feels like a large warehouse of all the crap that's taken off the shelves of the supermarket, heaving with overly loaded, artificially coloured, high fructose corn syrup sweetened cereals and Pop-Tarts and anything and everything which would contribute to the poor health of people who could otherwise live a healthy lifestyle, and so much more so for people who are on the margins of society. And it was terrible. And I see people conducting food drives all the time. So one of the things that we did was look at how can we conduct a healthy food drive? How can we educate people who want to give, who are coming from a good place, to understand that what you choose to give really has an impact on those who receive it. And then the second piece of that was starting to question, whose responsibility is it to be providing this food? If it's our government's responsibility, who is our government? And I say our government represents us. We voted them in. So therefore the government is us. There is no us and them. And they're answerable to us. And we need to find our voices and point out things we're not satisfied with. So in the new farm bill, some things are great, some things are very much not great. And our voices are what can be what's behind changing them. If you do give to a food drive, please try and vision it this way. Think of it as serving a guest or a beloved family member at your table. What would you want to feed them? And if the item that you're giving to the food pantry doesn't fit that criteria, then think twice about giving it. School lunches. I know in my town, this has been an ongoing battle for many years. In fact, this was really the start of my food activism. And it wasn't for my kids were just fine. But there are kids who go to the schools, and this is their primary, in some cases only source of nutrition, and what they were getting was not nutritious. And it may have fit into federal guidelines, but that really didn't mean a whole lot. The food should be nourishing to the kids' brains and hearts and belly. And we are up against an enormous and very complex food system, and corporations and global, you name it, we're up against it. So what can you do to change that? You can encourage your school to stop looking at school meals as a profit driver and think of it as a revenue-neutral program that is a fuel for learning. Kids are in school all day. Lunch is part of that day. Maybe lunch should be and could be seen as part of an educational experience, because we're creating the adults of tomorrow, not just in the maths class or the social studies class, but also in that cafeteria. In our district, we managed to change the RFP, which is the agreement between the food services supplier and the school district. And it was actually a very progressive RFP. It had all kinds of great things in there. No hormones, no antibiotics in the meat, whole cuts of meat only, and increasing the requirement for fruits and vegetables, sourcing local, documented efforts to source organic where possible, etc. But there was absolutely no oversight. So we had what feels like a really hollow victory, because on paper it looks terrific, but without oversight doesn't mean a whole lot. This year, as I'm sure you're all aware, with the introduction of the Common Core in New Jersey, the education system is, certainly in my town, just insane. There are factions and divisions, and everybody knows what's right and everybody knows what's wrong, and nobody seems to agree on either of those things. And to try and even have this conversation, it would be very hard to get an alliance with people. So this is something really important about being an activist. Recognize when to take a step back. Sometimes it's not the right time to do the next thing. So find something else to do with all that energy, because you're going to drive yourself nuts, you're going to burn out, you're going to walk away, and then you're no good to yourself or to anybody else. Find another area where you're going to be able to have tangible and quantifiable change. So we started guerrilla gardening. And I think of this as I think of many things as my little package of evolutions. So you start with evolution, which is a series of small changes. But don't stop at evolution, because then you've only made a tiny step forward and you're so busy patting yourself on the back you don't realize all the other steps you could have taken. Take your evolution all the way through to revolution, a fundamental systemic change. Be aware of the convolution that is our current food system. Access to affordable, healthy food is presented as something that is very complicated and difficult to understand and impossible to achieve, but it needn't be. Keep it simple. Inspire devolution. Take back the power from central government or central distributors to local people. And what's the ultimate way of taking local food back to local people? Grow your own. So there's a solution, and that's where guerrilla gardening was born. Guerrilla gardening aims to create an edible landscape, builds community and empowers people to grow their own food and reconnect with real food. It started with me going to a friend of mine who was a gardening genius. She just had to look at her garden and she had a farm's worth of food. I look at my garden and I have the entire wildlife population consuming whatever I've planted. And she was also phenomenally organized. So after 3 years of me at war with the groundhogs, I went to her and I said, teach me from the beginning. I will be as if I know nothing, take me through it step by step. And we started with seeds, and I wrote it all down. And we had a fantastic step-by-step, idiot-proof, with me being the idiot-proof system of growing from seed. I then looked at the seed packs and realized typically you get 24 to 30 seeds in a packet. Now, even if only half of my one variety of tomato germinates, I don't need 12 to 15 tomatoes of the same variety, and nor does anybody else, unless they're farming. So we have this abundance of plants available potentially from a seed pack. So we got 10 pioneer planters, and they're all planted 4 or 5 trays of 72 seeds each. And instantly, we ended up having 1,500 plants available for people. We ended up ultimately with 3,500 plants, which we shared, directly contacting over 500 families, 3 schools, a community centre, guests at a soup kitchen, I'm sure I'm forgetting, and a garden in a women's shelter. All from this little thing. It was really not expensive, it was really not too painful to organise. We built community, we had a big community swap. People could bring any plants they'd grown themselves to this, they could come and take whatever they wanted. All the way we had an open blog for people to share their glories and their disasters. We had people who were completely empowered. Those who swore they just had to look at a plant to kill it were suddenly able to produce food. We sent kids home who had grown food from seed in their class with plants for each of their families. And this created a connection from the school, from the classroom to the home. And especially in our district, and we're not unique in this, the fact the kids, the most at-risk kids, tend to have family members or whoever, the guardians, who are the hardest ones to connect to. And here we had this instant connection. It was a completely safe connection for people. And a great way to generate dialogue and interest at home about what was going on at school. We partnered with all kinds of local organisations, from the NAACP to Partners for Health, which is a hospital fund. People enjoyed the benefits of gardening, physical activity. You could cancel your gym membership. Vitamin D from the sun, saving money on food, and we could recalibrate ourselves. I don't know about you, but I'm welded completely inadvertently half the time to my computer or my smartphone. When I'm in the garden, I'm welded to my piece of soil and my plant, and I'm revitalizing my senses. I'm just enjoying it. Sometimes I'm not enjoying it. I'm swearing at it because it's not doing what I had planned. But you know what? It's just a different piece of my brain, and it's really refreshing and invigorating. And you feel so satisfied and triumphant when you start with a little seed that you can barely see in your hand, especially as my advancing years, I definitely can't see in my hand, to something that you can eat. It's an amazing transformation. It is so empowering. And of course, it leads to a real relationship to food. It's very different to eat some cherry tomatoes that you've grown than buying a package in a clamshell in the supermarket. And there's always something you can grow. Don't think that you cannot grow something. I have the same philosophy for gardening as I do for parenting, which is benign neglect. I'll give you a little bit of input, then I'm going to step back and you're on your own. So my kids are really independent, which is great for them. It's a nightmare for me, but it was a good plan, I think. And I find that tomatillos are my children of the garden. They just went nuts. Other plants, not so much, but so I'm clearly a tomatillo person. So whatever your level of gardening skill, there is something you can grow, and wherever you live, there is something you can grow. We found plants that could be kept in pots, and we sent those home with guests from our soup kitchen. So even people who had no outdoor space could find a little corner somewhere where they could be growing something. So as you can tell from all of this, I'm basically inherently a lazy person. And I wanted to find a way to do whatever it is I'm trying to achieve easily. Which means I'm looking for ways to delegate, to form partnerships, and to create connections so that it's not me doing everything. And how this ties into food activism is those partnerships. I'm happy to share with you that I have 2 beehives in my garden, and I don't look after them. There is a beekeeper who wants to have hives, and he has a limited amount of land, so he's looking for places. So the bees live in my yard. He comes over and tends to them. We come and hang out with him. We all learn about the bees. The bees are very happy because we have lots of flowers for them to pollinate from all of these vegetables we're growing. Our vegetables are very happy because they've got the bees pollinating them. And we get paid rent in a jar of the most local honey you can possibly find. It's a fabulous dynamic. And it's mutually beneficial, and I can continue to be lazy. I also seek out, and I recommend this to you, seek out existing programs and people who are already working in the area that you're interested in. There's no need to start another not-for-profit. There's no need to be the third slow food movement in New Jersey. Speak to Jim, join up with what he's doing. Okay, there's power in numbers, but it doesn't mean you have to have a series of numbers of people all doing the same thing in their little silos. Work together. Right now, everyone in this room is in a great starting place, because there's no wrong place to be. Wherever you are today, you can take a step and be somewhere better by tomorrow. Saving the whole world is overwhelming, so just choose one concrete area to start in, preferably an area you have a passion in, because that will make it that much more interesting for you, and ask yourself, what is my action going to be? Thank you.